When she went out, I suppose she had to let strangers know that she was unclean, so as to not be touched and make them unclean. Now, when we talk about social distancing in our culture, in the last week we've talked a lot about social distancing. It's been mentioned in many news networks and every newspaper you pick up. It does not include not touching family members. But this woman, Mrs. No Name, this would have impacted her touching even within her own family. Think about it, what this woman would have been feeling after 12 years of social distancing. We struggle having social distancing in 1 week. I needed to go to a hardware store. There was some things that needed repair on my property, and I went to a hardware store in Ephrata area. Big signs before you got in. Please respect social distancing. Stay 6 feet away from every customer and every store clerk, employee at the hardware store. And people were respecting that. And it was an inconvenience. And it is an inconvenience. We're talking about it after 1 week. It may even get worse. Think about living that way for 12 years. Now what is she feeling? Unloved, maybe. She might be feeling isolated, distant, cut off, unappreciated. Think of how many committees she may have wanted to serve on, to get involved in the Festival of Life, or to get involved in something. No one would want her. It wasn't easy for her. She wasn't able to have technological advances like Michael's introducing me to, Pastor Michael. Very, very conveniently, makes it convenient for me because of him. But she wouldn't have had those resources. It would have been very hard to contribute in her culture because she was bleeding for 12 years. And so at the end of this, describing of her, we would expect that the next line would read, Mrs. No Name, destined to die, stayed in her home, pulled the covers over her head, and became extremely depressed and desolate. That's what we would expect to read. I'd like you to refer you back to verse 27 from the text of Mark chapter 5. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd. And we see a woman here in the midst of isolation, in the midst of anxiety, in the midst of helplessness, hopelessness, powerlessness, all of those emotions. We see this woman on the move. You talk about strength. A mental and emotional strength that was lit on fire when she heard about Jesus. She came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. Now, if you were all sitting here, I'd ask, what made her sneak in behind him and touch him? Most of the people Jesus healed, he healed with eye contact. Looking at them. Very few people were healed by touching him from behind. But I believe the reason she snuck up behind him is because maybe she was afraid of the crowd. that if she announced her presence, they would scream, "Unclean, away from us." Maybe she was also concerned that by touching Jesus' cloak, she would make this great teacher unclean. What I find amazing here about our God is He doesn't care if you're unclean. He doesn't care what your past is. He wants you to touch Him. No matter what you're struggling with today, reach out and touch Jesus. She thought, if I just touch His clothes, I will be healed. And that thought shows us a woman in the midst of great pain, having clear vision and insight and theology about who God is. Can we adopt her theology? If I just touch His clothes, I will be healed. You say, "Dave, you don't know about my past." I don't care about your past. I don't care about it because God doesn't care about it. He says, "Touch me." This woman gives us perhaps one of the strongest teachings of theology as I see in the pages of Scripture. Verse 29. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was free from her suffering. Immediately her bleeding stopped. Jesus is in the business of healing. Come to Him. Touch Him. Your bleeding will be stopped. Now it gets interesting. Verse 30. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from Him, and He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes? Who touched my clothes?" Verse 31 gives us a little bit of an insight into the pregnant pause that would have happened when Jesus stopped. See, everybody was excited. Everybody was anticipating Jesus going to minister to Jairus' daughter. They would have felt a time crunch. This little young girl was dying. And so they would have been expecting Jesus to be moving with haste. Jesus almost never moved with haste. He walked slowly through the crowd. And the disciples said to Him, "You see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. This reminds me of some of my teachers from middle school days when a person would shoot a spitball and it would stick to the chalkboard on which the teacher was writing, and the teacher would turn around and say, "Who did it?" Nobody would admit they'd done it. He said, "I'm not going to teach anymore until I know who did it." He stopped the whole class. And in one case, I remember all of us getting into trouble because nobody would admit it. Jesus stopped, no longer in a hurry. It's almost as though He forgot Jairus' daughter. So, who touched me? Now, why was it important for Jesus to know who touched Him? It was important, I believe, because Jesus was not done healing her. Yes, it is true that in that moment she was healed physically. I anticipate she wanted to sneak back out of that crowd and go home and celebrate the fact that finally, after 12 years, her bleeding had stopped. And Jesus said, no, not so fast. In that pregnant pause, perhaps her anxiety became even greater. What we do know is that she became fearful. Verse 33. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at His feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole story. It's a story he already knew. If we believe that he was asking these questions, who touched my clothes and who touched me, because he didn't know, then we have to conclude that our God is a stupid God, and we do not serve a stupid God. He was not asking these questions because he didn't know the answer. He was asking these questions, giving this woman a platform onto which to tell her story of change. Because I believe that when she told her story of change, it further healed her. How? Spiritually. Whenever we tell our testimony, whenever we tell our story of change, we become emboldened. And the next time we tell it, it's a little bit easier. I believe he wanted her to tell her story of change because there were others in that crowd who needed to hear her story of change. I believe he wanted to tell her story of change so that the people, her community, would treat her differently, would now know that she was no longer unclean. His response to her is one of intimacy. He said to her, "Daughter, this is the only time she receives a name. And perhaps it's the strongest name and the best name she could ever have, said to her after 12 years of suffering by the creator of the world, the creator of her body. He looks at her and he says, 'Daughter.' And he takes no credit for her healing, but gives her all the credit. 'Daughter, your faith has healed you.' Go in peace and be free from your suffering." This testimony, this story that she told in the midst of all her emotion, fear, changed her life, changed the lives of many people around, and continue to change the lives of those who read her story. Today, when you woke in a changed world. And I suspect that next week, when we wake and we consider the week ahead of us and what we'll be looking in the rearview mirror, we'll notice that we have more changes. In the midst of those emotions that those changes bring, we have a choice. To live faithfully and tell our story of change, or to stay in bed and allow those emotions to control us. My prayer is that my emotions would not control my faith, and the same is true for you. Let's pray.